Welcome to our Beyond 20 campaign, a celebration of One Joshua Group's 20 years of service excellence. This is a One Joshua Group production, providing access to information and experts to help improve quality of life and health outcomes.
Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is someone that we're very familiar with. Not only is she expert in her area, but we called her friend. It's always so important to be able to sit with family and have conversations. It makes a lot different. So welcome, Kendal Whitlock. And Kendal Whitlock is the head of digital optimization at Real World Evidence Clinical Trials. And she's with Walgreens Booth Alliance. Kendal, it's so good to see you.
Thank you, Kermit. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. It's really a privilege to be in the conversation.
Thank you. Kendal reminds us that each of us should see each other more often. So I'll take her with that in the opening and say that to all of you. We should take the opportunity to see each other more often. Kendal, today we're talking about why the representation matters in clinical trials. So since that's the topic, what's your thought about that? Why is it important that minorities participate in clinical trials?
You know, this question has been asked for decades, and this conversation has been ongoing for quite some time. If I look back in my own professional career trajectory, even from my early years as a medical science liaison in the pharmaceutical industry, this was a conversation that was top of mind for my key opinion leaders. We had molecules in development, and those investigators were seeing differences in their patient populations that gave them cause for pause. And part of that pause was that they thought they understood the science from any given manufacturer as they were getting more experience through investigator-initiated trials and other things. But what they observed was that there's a segment of their patient populations that doesn't seem to respond to these molecules in the same way as the majority of the rest of their patient population. And it left them with curiosity. So I was exposed to this topic for the first time through people like Dr. Elijah Saunders, when I worked for an organization that had an ACE inhibitor in phase 3, and subsequent to that, an ARB with another organization. Same set of thought leaders, Dr. Saunders and others in the DC, Maryland area, and just something's different. And so the question of diversity became one that I sort of took on as these are the things that my thought leaders care about because their patients are not supported fully in the therapeutic options that they were recommending. And so ultimately, fast forward a number of years, what we see now today in the conversations is really the same conversation. And if we think about what drug development or medical product broadly, to include medical devices, is for, it is to ensure the safety and effectiveness of a medical product. And if that is not tested in development and we don't have that evidence generated from clinical trials, then the clinical community does not have that in their toolbox, the knowledge of safety and efficacy of the medical product. So ultimately, that is why this is so important.
So that's that real world evidence, huh?
Well, real world evidence brings in another layer to what I mentioned, and that historically, the gold standard of clinical trials being randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials as the highest level of evidence when we talk about clinical trials. But real-world evidence is the introduction, or real-world data specifically, is what is the lived experience of people. And if we can bring more evidence from the way a patient lives their life, so if this patient has type 2 diabetes, and they participate in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, then the knowledge from the trial makes up less in the outcomes of how that patient is doing than the majority of the information that could lead to the outcomes that that person has. And that larger amount of information is from the real world evidence that's generated from that data and brought to bear on clinical recommendations.
So I guess that speaks to the absolute requirement of representation of minorities across the spectrum in clinical trials. And
Right.
it's very good to know that. One Joshua Group celebrates its 20th year this year, and we're always very excited about that. And I share with you in that celebration that the first client we had was one of the three leading pharmaceutical companies, and our first project was to work to engage minority physicians and others in phase 2 clinical trials. So that's where we started 20 years ago, Kendall. And in 20 years, we've continued to be engaged in that discussion. Are there improvements being made in engaging minorities, again, across the spectrum in clinical trials? If the answer is yes, then how and why? And if the answer is no, then why not? And how do we improve that engagement?
Right. So the short answer is yes, there have been improvements. If you look at the most recent FDA snapshots, you can see that in the period of time of the most recently approved products, there is an appreciable improvement in diverse representation by race and ethnicity, for example, as well as of women. However, there is still work to be done. And that work to be done has to address more broadly the unmet needs. Social determinants of health, for example, are things that we now know play a great part in the outcomes of patients. So we can't think about only the small, narrow numbers of participants in clinical trials. We have to think more broadly about where people are getting treated. Are people in care, and is there continuity of their care such that they would have an opportunity to be exposed to an invitation from a clinical provider on the opportunity to participate in clinical trials? If you have inconsistencies in the healthcare you receive, a lot of people during the pandemic, for example, lost their jobs. People lose their job, they lose their health insurance. You lose your health insurance, you may not be able to afford your medication. You may not be consistently going back to see your provider. So, and if that is the person, the professional from which the invitation is most trusted, then where else might one find that conversation and the invitation to think about a clinical trial in the context of their care? Nothing like the retail pharmacy in your community, but I'll save that for the next question.
So, increasing minority participation in clinical trials as patients. Are we making any changes in increasing minority participation as providers and those people who engage patients in participating and making patients aware that these trials are available?
I think this is a question we could unpack for quite some time right now. From the perspective of patients, there are patients who are familiar with clinical trials, and we can't think about representation in clinical trials as being one thing, because in rare diseases, the concept of a clinical trial, the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, means something very differently to an individual with a rare disease where perhaps there is no approved therapy for that very rare condition. And it also, clinical trials that is, means something very differently perhaps to oncology patients across the spectrum of tumor types or hematologic malignancies versus those with chronic illnesses, maybe an asthma or a hypertension. We've got to think about where the clinical trial fits into disease management from that clinical community's point of view. But patients, generally speaking, may not have any differences in the way that they learn about clinical trials over the last, say, 20 years since we have been tackling this very challenging and difficult problem. But what we do understand from patient surveys about relevance. So it's not so much that a person may not want to participate, and all patients are not the same. So we are not going to say that, well, this group of people doesn't trust the medical establishment, or this group of people distrust the medical establishment because of things that have happened to them directly or things that they have heard about to people in their community. Perhaps the issue is nobody ever invited me to a clinical trial. Or perhaps the fact of the matter is, if you have inconsistencies in your exposure to the healthcare system, the likelihood that you would understand what clinical trials are in the grand scheme of that context is less so. So the information from a clinical trial, not just the data out of clinical trials, but what it is in the context of managing disease, is something that is less familiar, less relevant in your life.
Mhm.
So, think about just sitting around the Thanksgiving table or the holiday table, the conversations that are happening in families. Sometimes managing disease is simply going to the doctor regularly. Some people don't have that regular engagement with others
Mhm.
to have the conversation in the first place. So, just what's relevant about a clinical trial is
Mhm.
also key.
So, are we doing anything differently to engage providers? We we're going to circle back and talk about trust. We're not going to talk
Yes.
about that right now. So, is there some relevancy in providers who look like you, who look like me, us, anybody, however they look? Is there something about providers making patients aware of the availability of clinical trials or being invited, as you said?
Right. So this is something to unpack quite extensively too. So first, the number of investigators in clinical trials hasn't changed that much in the last 20 years. So if we think about the fact that only about 4% of physicians, for example, are investigators in clinical trials, and that a large majority of them participate in one trial only, the
Hmm.
what's being done with providers to maybe stimulate the conversation or stimulate the engagement of patients for clinical trials is limited. It's limited in the fact that clinicians have very limited time to do the job of a medical doctor in diagnosing and managing a disease. And often, if they themselves are not doing clinical trials, some clinicians fear losing their patient population if they
Hmm.
refer patients to clinical trials. Say, for example, this is a provider in an urban environment where there is no infrastructure for research, and the only research that's proximate to them is at the academic medical center. And the fear that clinician may have of losing their patient to coming back to their practice to be managed,
Hmm.
as opposed to going to the clinical trial at the medical center, and then that risk of that patient not returning. So, what is being done? Many of the sponsor organizations are working in partnership with others, community based organizations, with professional medical organizations, to make training available on clinical trials. And there are multiple examples I could cite here, but I don't know how much time we actually have. So, suffice to say that there is an effort, and there have been historic, as you and I well know, things like a Project Impact out of the National Medical Association, and then
Hmm.
there being talk of Project Impact 2.0, because we know that even educating clinicians about clinical trial, providing training for clinical trial experiences, in and of itself does not match those trained individuals to
Hmm.
actual trials. So if you then have a number, hundreds of newly trained, maybe even minority serving clinicians whose patient populations have a substantial portion, maybe 30% or more, from diverse racial and ethnic groups, does not mean that they are guaranteed getting the opportunity to be an investigator or a principal or sub investigator in a clinical trial. So manufacturers have a history of going to sites that they have historically worked with,
Hmm.
those sites being trained on the company's policies and procedures. But we also know that there is a literature on, in some racial and ethnic groups, having a preference for the concordance of that provider
Hmm.
being a match to themselves, and that making them feel more comfortable in the setting.
Well, it's encouraging that what you mentioned is that investigators are being stimulated.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I wanted to emphasize that because I believe that the issue of trust from the patient side um, increases with knowing that the investigators have been stimulated versus incentivized.
Mhm.
So I think that patients got stuck on the fact that the reason they were doing this was because I was going to be the guinea pig. They were going to make money on us rather than understanding that clinical trials are indeed another modality, another opportunity for you to receive clinical care, as you mentioned, and quite often at a reduced or no cost to you to really get state of the art practice of medicine. So being able to utilize that and having investigators share that information with patients. Now we're going to get back and talk about the real elephant in the room that everybody wants to say is problematic, and that is the discussion about trust in clinical trials. What say ye about that?
I love this conversation about trust because the more I dig into what does trust mean to the patient, I work for Walgreens. Walgreens is over a 120-year-old organization that has an established level of trust in communities across this country. There are 9,000 Walgreens locations in the United States. 78% of Americans live within 5 miles of a Walgreens. So people are familiar and there's continuity in seeing your Walgreens where you live. And there's always this notion when we bring up the issue of trust of whether or not we meet people where they are. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the factor that erodes trust is people speaking in terms that are unfamiliar, and that being the issue that raises a flag for some people. But coming back to what is familiar to people and why I think the opportunity in bringing clinical trials to communities where we already serve populations is the fact that trust is not one thing. There is a team that has published on trustworthiness. And I first heard Reuben Warren talk from Tuskegee talk about why don't we flip this around and stop putting the onus on patients to
Patients.
trust in the establishment because that's not their profession, that's not their
Mm-hmm.
experience. So maybe modeling what trustworthiness is should be the conversation we're having around trust. So this team, lead author was Stallings, published on a trustworthiness scale, and there was a history of work, years of work before this validation of this trustworthiness scale. And what they found was that trust is across multiple different domains, is different in white populations than Hispanic populations, and there is statistical significance between white and Hispanic and between white and
Mm-hmm.
Black. And there are some patterns and trends that are similar between Hispanic and Black. So when we talk about the issue of trust, we have to factor in, well, what is trust to you, to me, to the next person? And it's not necessarily, the erosion of trust is not necessarily for the same reasons. So when we start to
Mm-hmm.
think about how do we build and establish trust, we've got to think about what does trustworthiness look like to you in my
Mm-hmm.
behavior or in my actions as an organization? How may I best serve you?
So, Kendall, I'm interested in finding out. I'm speaking for a friend.
Mhm.
Where can I get more information about uh, resources around participating in a clinical trial?
There are a number of resources. The first I would say is we know that not everybody trusts their government, and I have to say it like that, just being tongue in cheek. But we do know that there are innumerable resources in government sites. So the Office of Minority Health, for example, has updated a lot of the resources that are available online, and people can go and find updated videos. They can hear voice of patient. There are also universities across the country through their translational institutes that are creating
Mm-hmm.
resources for different populations. There are some, for example, that create resources for children. And that way, if a parent has an opportunity to consider a clinical trial for their child, they would be able to not only understand it in lay language, but they would be able to have a conversation with their child about what a clinical trial is. So both they and their child is comfortable in the decision. There are resources by patient advocacy organizations about clinical trials. Most importantly, we are looking to partner and co create resources. So, Walgreens has 130 million customers, and that means that in the pharmacy, people are coming back to their pharmacists routinely to refill prescriptions. What an ideal way to
Mm-hmm.
depend on another trusted healthcare professional, your pharmacy, and somewhere where you go routinely. Maybe you are regularly picking up your script
Mm-hmm.
to be able to rely on the evidence of information about the things that Walgreens can do in your community.
We have a question in the chat, and that is, how much does it cost to participate in a clinical trial?
For most
The-
patients, now all studies are going to be different, so there isn't one answer. And as you said previously, I don't know if we had started, but that many trials have no or little cost to a person. There are some sponsor organizations that provide travel vouchers, for example. Some sponsor organizations with some of their trials provide child care, vouchers. Some give the participants a card to draw down from for the expenses that they might incur. But every study is different. Every sponsor has differences in the way that they handle this. Walgreens actually has a new relationship with Uber for some patients. And so getting transportation, we know far distances from sites is one of the barriers to participation. So if we can leverage that opportunity, that collaborative partnership to engage people who would like to consider a clinical trial, then we can say that we've reduced that barrier to their participation.
Well, access is a critically important discussion. People have said that access, and we say that access is a barrier. Mm-hmm. You've helped to address some of those concerns where there may be belief that access is problematic. And we thank you so much for joining us today in our 20th year celebration Beyond. And we want to give you almost the last word, and that is, what should be the takeaway message to our viewing audience about participating in clinical trials?
I think the takeaway message should be the fact that there's a higher prevalence of disease among some racial and ethnic groups. And if we are to be worth our weight in salt, then we should consider clinical trial participation as a part of the continuum of care in conversation with your doctor, making decisions to participate. So thank you again, Kermit, for the opportunity to join you today.
Well, thank you. And we want to remind people that clinical trials are part of the continuum of care. Think about that first and not last. Again, thank you, Kendal. We hope to see you again. And thank each of you for joining us for Beyond, part of our 20th celebration. Speak to you soon. Be kind.
This edition of Beyond 20 is a Life Beat podcast sponsored by One Joshua Group, your strategic source of engagement to improve life through better health, education, and information. For more information, visit us at theonejoshuagroup.com or follow our work on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter using hashtag OneJGCollabs. One Joshua Group, building capacity, expanding resources, joining what you know with what we've learned.